The common narrative surrounding the Arab Spring has been that the most important factor which ignited the flame lit on the 4th of January was the new technologies which had arrived in the first decade of the 21st century. Facebook and the new wave of online social networks allowed the youth to organize and carry the Arab Spring on its back. But there's definitely a link between social and online networks and the Arab Spring. This was in no way the catalyst for the mass protest. For one, there is no clean link between the, as quoted, levels of internet penetration and other IT indicators, such as the spread of social media networks, and on the other, proclivity for and intensity of social protests, exemplified by the fact that both countries with high internet usage, such as Bahrain, and countries with minuscule internet usage, like Yemen and Libya, experienced mass protests in the beginning stages of the Arab Spring. Of course, the situation later evolved way worse in Libya and Yemen than it did in Bahrain, but in the initial phases there was not that big of a difference. Further, Iran, of whose population is one of the most internet savvy, didn't experience any large-scale protests at all as compared to other countries in that region. While it might have not been the catalyst for the revolution, it still played an important role in the revolutions as the new networks allowed the information to spread faster. First seen through the April 6th youth movement, which called for protests against the government, and later through the rapid spread of information and images which facilitated the mobilization of rioters and the flaming of the revolution, not lit by Facebook and Twitter, but a complex list of socio-economic and political factors which were only amplified by Twitter and Facebook and the wide list of social media networks. When first looking at the available data for the Arab nations in the years prior to the Arab Spring, one thing is clear: these nations may have not experienced the rapid GDP growths of the East Asian tigers, but still, they were far away from stagnant and far above many Western developed nations. All countries averaged above 2% GDP growth in the 2 decades before the Arab Spring, and most enjoyed average growth rates above 4%, a number few developed nations can consistently sustain, with only the real outlier being Morocco. 2 decades before the Arab Spring, Tunisia quadrupled its GDP from $12 billion to $46 billion. Egypt 5 times its GDP from $42 billion to $219 billion, and Yemen doubled its GDP from around $12 billion to $25 billion. It is important to note that Yemen experienced a strong depression around 1995, as by 1994 they had already reached the levels exceeding those they would reach in 2010, but the GDP reached levels far lower than those in 1990, reaching rock bottom in 1996 with a GDP of around $6.5 billion. In this context, it's important to note that all of these nations, especially Egypt, experienced rapid population growth, which balances out the quick economic growth. But still, when looking at this graph describing GDP growth per capita as a ratio of the US GDP growth per capita, most Arab nations might have not enjoyed the rapid rise of China's or India's GDP, but they still enjoyed a stable GDP per capita growth. At those rates, Jordan would have caught up with the US somewhere around 2060, Tunisia would catch up around 2070, Morocco around 2080, and Egypt around 2009. If this economic growth rate would have continued until 2010, $2 a day poverty would have been nearly completely wiped out in Jordan, reduced by 75% in Tunisia, and by 50% in Egypt. But still, the population was largely unhappy, with all Arab nations having high dissatisfaction ratings, with Iraq being the clear outlier, which can largely be explained by the civil conflict and fallout of the Second Iraq War, which affected Iraq at that time. To explain why economic growth may not translate directly into a good approval of the government, one must look at Tunisia, one of the countries who experienced the greatest growth and would presumably prosper under the strong economy, was cloaked in an image of modernity, as President Ben Ali had created an image of a modern technocratic nation to seem tourist-friendly, while simultaneously enacting strong restrictions on the freedom of speech, a facade which could only be sustained in the large urban centers, as the disparities between the rural countryside and the urban centers destroyed this image of a technocratic nation. The conclusion you would draw from this is that the economy wasn't the definitive reason for why the Arab Spring started, as in comparison to other conflicts, the economy wasn't stagnant or in a recession or depression, but was growing at a stable rate. This This, in combination with the fact that the main demands made by the protesters weren't economic reforms, but bigger and more social justice and democratic reform. But the economy may have been, or still, an underlying factor for the conflict, and an undisputed motivator as especially the middle class and the youth suffered. Even though the Arab nations had stable growth, there was still a large economic inequity and low economic opportunities, especially for the young educated people. According to this graph, all of the Arab countries had low governance scores, especially in the areas of voice accountability, with Tunisia, the origin point of the revolution, having the lowest score out of all of the listed Arab nations, even beating out Yemen. The conclusion drawn from this is that the Arab Spring must have happened as a result of the people's demand for political power and freedom. So is this just the logical step of evolution of states that with greater economic freedom and opportunity the population began to ask for more civil and political rights? But sadly, the picture isn't as clear as it may look, as while the World Values Survey from 2010 to 2014 confirmed that nearly 99% of Egyptians, 86% of Jordanians and Tunisians, 85% of Moroccans and 80% of Yemenis said that democracy is the preferred form of government, what they associate with democracy might not necessarily match with our Western understanding of democracy. As another World Values Survey, which asked what the essential characteristics of democracy were for the surveyed, confirmed while yes, the biggest association with democracy are free elections, both the characteristics of taxing rich to subsidize the poor and government providing unemployed benefits, both two definitively economic areas, all beat out the other options the surveyed could choose, like characteristics that we in the West would more associate with democracy, like protection of civil liberties or equal rights for women. While this doesn't completely rule out the idea that it was just a call for democracy, it shows that the economy might have been just as big of a driver as the call for democracy. But this consolation is in no way something irregular, as when we look at other famous revolutions similar to the Arab Spring, like the American and French revolutions, you'll also see that the initial revolt always comes as a result of economic problems, which then lead into political change. Another survey that weakens the argument that the Arab Spring was completely a result of political factors was an Arab Barometer survey from 2012 to 2014, where they asked Tunisians for the reason why they were revolted against President Ben Ali. The biggest reason given by Tunisians was the weak economy, as about 60% declared that the reason was a weak economy. Close behind that were at around 17% corruption and at around 15% lack of political freedom, followed by want more Islamization and don't know at under 5%. This only reinforced the idea that Arabs wanted democracy, but primarily because they believed this would bring more economic benefits for their countries and themselves. If the answer doesn't purely lie in either economic or political factors, it must be a mix of both, especially the large disparities between the countryside and the large cities show this, as even though in all Arab countries besides Jordan, the rural population makes up about 30 to 70% of the total population, none contribute more than 20% of the total GDP. Surprisingly, the ratio of GDP to share of rural population is far higher than the EU standard, where around 24% of the population lives in rural areas, but agriculture makes up around only 1.6% of the GDP. But even though the rural areas play such an important role for the economy, these areas are also the poorest. Based on World Development Indicators, poverty is mostly a problem in rural areas. In Morocco, rural poverty is about 3 times higher than urban poverty, while in Egypt and Yemen it's twice as high. The middle class is the economic backbone of most nations. As earlier established, the economy did grow in the years preceding the Arab Spring, and so did the middle class. As in most Arab nations, the middle class doubled, if not tripled in size preceding the Arab Spring. But just as the middle class increased in size, also the group below the middle class increased in size. And all countries but Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, and Morocco, the number of people below the middle class rose from 52.5 million, 3.0 million, and 23.4 million in 1990 to 36 million, 4 million, and 28.5 million in 2010. The number of people below the middle class in Yemen nearly doubled from 11.8 to 23.5 million. But even more than those groups, the group which arguably suffered the most is the youth. When looking at the graph of unemployment, it is notable that while youth unemployment is still relatively higher than in the comparators, not by a big margin, but still relatively higher, it is way higher among especially females, as besides Qatar and Bahrain, all other Arab nations have a youth female unemployment higher than 30%. And as Hafiz Ghanem puts it in his book The Arab Spring 5 Years Later, overall youth unemployment does not appear to be particularly high in the Arab region, but there are 3 important issues relating to the youth job market. First, Female unemployment is exceptionally high, and female labor force participation is exceptionally low, which makes it difficult for young couples to create middle-class families with 2 working adults. Second, unemployment seems to rise with education level, which leads to greater dissatisfaction on the part of the unemployed graduates and their families. Third, those who do find jobs are often dissatisfied because they end up finding only precarious and poorly paid employment. As mentioned, educated Arabs are especially affected by unemployment, as seen by this graph. In Jordan, illiterate Jordanians had an unemployment rate of close to 0%, while Jordanians with an education less than secondary have a total unemployment rate of close to 44%. Especially men with an education lower than secondary have an unemployment rate of 60%. Both Jordanians with a secondary or an intermediate diploma have an unemployment rate of around 9%, while Arabs with a bachelor or above have an unemployment rate of 37%, with women having a staggering 70% unemployment rate, where men only have an unemployment rate of only 23%. It is in this context important to note that the majority of young Arabs still have a job. Most of these jobs are only part-time employment, as only a third of 15 to 29-year-old Arabs are working full-time for an employee. In comparison, Arab men are around 20 points under the world average, and Arab females are around 6 points under the world average. To conclude, the quick growth of the population of the Arab countries created a huge young population and led to a general scarcity of jobs, especially for the Arab youth. The result of these factors is clear. The lack of job opportunities for both male and especially female youths led to a general dissatisfaction, as even if they were able to find a job, most only found precarious and poorly paid jobs. Further, they depended on a second income to sustain a proper middle-class household, which they couldn't gain. They couldn't start their proper business lives by marrying and stepping up the social ladder and creating new middle-class families. Described by Assad and Basum 2007, this has led to a whole generation in waiting for better jobs, waiting for housing, waiting to get married and raise a family. Some of the social ills observed in some Arab countries today could probably be explained, at least in part, by this situation. A generation of unemployed, educated young people were left to their own devices, with now a better understanding of the world than their parents ever had. Further, this in combination with the rapid corruption and low accountability of the government led to a breaking point embodied by the fate of Mohammed Bouazizi, who in his life experienced the same ill fate that many Arabs and Tunisians experienced in that point in time, as he also became disenfranchised with the government, humiliated by the government, who both took his job and robbed his family of their support and later didn't even care for him. He enacted self-immolation. This marked the beginning of the Arab Spring, which was only escalated by both the violent reactions of many of the local governments and the new social technologies, which allowed images and texts and informations to travel way faster than they did 20 years ago. What I completely forgot to mention in my original recording was that there were similar protests happening in Europe as well, where the political factors didn't exist in the same dimension. And most of the protesters in Europe requested economic reforms. I hope you enjoyed this video. This was long in the making. Thank you guys. I appreciate it. This year is gonna be a big year. Bigger than the last one. Smaller than the next. Markus Weismann, out.